Americans took to the streets after the murder of George Floyd, rejecting racism in all of its forms. Today's guest argues that structural racism has a long history in the United States, as do the efforts to combat it. She's Tricia Rose this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Joining me as he does every week in the co-host chair is my great friend and colleague G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Each week we talk about big issues with great guests, storytellers, novelists, scholars, and more to make sense of the big stories shaping the United States today. This week we're joined by one of our favorite scholars. Tricia Rose is the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University and co-host of the new podcast, The Tightrope. Tricia, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Jim. Great to see you both.
So there is so much that we want to talk with you about, the events of the summer, your current work, but let's start with the murder of George Floyd and the protests that it kicked off across the country. Is there a narrative or a framework for understanding that you view these events?
Yeah. Well, it was a horrible and almost unwatchable video. And I think the main lens that I have been viewing it through is a combination of the accumulation of many such documented cases, right, and video footage over the past decade, and the length of the brutality and the casual nonchalance on the facial expressions of the officer, right? I mean, he didn't look troubled. There was no struggle. He just, was just there to take his life, pretty much. And those contexts, the history of these images, the accumulation of the lived experience of people of color with this kind of ongoing, harassment, violence, and then there's the context of COVID-19, which I think is a very important catalyst. It's not that it's the primary catalyst, but I see it as one of the multiple tipping points that really produced a level of rage and just, we've had enough, right? That kind of movie network, we're just not going to take it anymore type of spirit, not just among African Americans, but among all walks of life in the United States, people from everywhere, race, all races, cultures, and so on. And what COVID did as another point of catalyst was um, make people really tap into the vulnerability of one's life, right? Because March, April, and May, we were all pretty much not sure who was going to die. I mean, it was just people were just dying and nobody could understand why. And here was a situation where someone's life was literally going to be snuffed out on film as if it didn't matter. And I think people tapped into that, right? Because of the unregulated irrationality of COVID, right? And the police really became a sort of human embodiment of that. And I think those things all taken together were really important parts of why there's been such widespread, sustained protest.
I don't want to be needlessly provocative.
Oh, well,
I heard an author describe the film and the murder of George Floyd as a videotaped lynching. Do you think that's a reasonable characterization?
Yes, in a few key ways, and then maybe no in a couple of other ways. The key ways I think it is true is that it was a public, near taking, right, of a life that was justified by the assumption that the authority of the police was as judge, jury, and executioner, right? There was no due process even as a question, and it was done in public in front of others. Um, and it was done with the sanctioning of the state, right? If you look at the cohort of police around, they were all, keeping the crowd away, right? And there was a kind of state support, even though, eventually we're hoping that that support will be ended. Where it's not like a lynching is that we want to be very mindful that many lynchings, although not all, were public spectacles that were supported by whites, and people would bring baskets of food and celebrate. It was really a kind of social occasion. And so this in many ways was a lynching in a black part of town, as it were, right, with many people of color and their allies standing around screaming and asking the police to stop, which of course was not usually how lynchings took place. So the socialization aspect was different, but the other elements were are very similar. I actually think it's quite a legitimate parallel.
So, a number of voices since that, and actually before that, but with greater with greater volume and with greater vigor, I guess, have called for defunding of police. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering what your take is on defunding of police. It means different things in different contexts to different people, but what does it mean to you, and is it
Yeah.
feasible?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing I'd want your viewers to keep in mind is that defunding the police never means almost never means ending the police in all forms and all iterations. That's the abolishment community, right? There's a relatively small but intelligent and a visionary group of people who think that we should abolish the police. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I don't think they should be understood as crackpots because they're not. So there's the abolitionists, and then there's the defunders, and the defunders are also a very diverse group of people with different perspectives. The most consistent feature of what I understand to be the core concepts for the defunding of the police mission is to recognize that the kinds of circumstances that we call the police for are literally places that would have normally been the purview of others, like social workers, counselors, mental health professionals, family members, community leaders, right? So we call the police to adjudicate every possible conflict, and their general disposition, their lack of training in many ways, and some of their vigor to respond particularly to people of color and to poor people with aggression, and to look for ways to criminalize them, turn what should be situations that can easily be resolved without aggression, violence, or criminalization into criminal acts. So the defunding is about constraining the scope of what the police get called for, and using those resources to hire what some are now calling public safety. I'd like to think of them as community protection advocates, right? And, I think that's a very important piece of this puzzle because the police budgets have expanded exponentially over the last 40 years. They've been militarized, they've been getting surplus, literally military equipment to respond to local citizens. And they've been encouraged to see poor people and people of color as fundamentally criminal. We learned in Ferguson how the police force used minor infractions, seeking the criminalization of minor infractions to beef up the municipal budget. So they're also sources of funding. So there's a whole set of problematic expansions, corruptions, and extreme use of force for circumstances that never warrant it. That is, I think, key to the defunding. It's not the ending and budget zero. It's the reconfiguration in a major way.
So you have written and researched extensively about structural racism. It's
Hmm.
really one of the hallmarks of your great work. For those in our audience who may not be familiar with the term or are sort of vaguely familiar with the term, break that down for us. What does that mean?
Right, right. Well, before I define structural racism, and thank you for those kind words, by the way, too.
Well, they're heartfelt and it's true.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Before we talk about structural racism, I just want to mention two other kinds of racism that I think are in people's minds, and so it'll help them distinguish between these categories. Generally, when we call something racism, we think of personal beliefs and biases, right? If you look in the Webster's Dictionary, you'll see racism is, a kind of fixed belief of that some groups of people are categorically superior and others are inferior. So when you think of racism in that way, many people would say, I'm not a racist. I do not believe that, right? It's a fairly extreme definition of belief of fixed hierarchies based on race, right? Whites on top, other people of color lower, and Black people almost uniformly at the bottom. Institutional racism is racism that happens inside of a given institution. And that does not have to be based on personal belief, but it can be based on modes of racial discrimination, vulnerable, coworkers. It could be police as an institution, right? Targeting racial profiling, right? In other words, a policeman can racially profile and at the same time not think that he believes in a fixed hierarchy based on race. I know that sounds kind of insane, but it's entirely true. Um, and then there's systemic or structural racism, which is a network of institutions, right? Not just the police, but education, public health, all aspects of the criminal justice system, housing, wealth accumulation. It examines the interconnections between different institutions and areas of society, and taken together, a systemic set of forces that produce chronic and adverse outcomes for people of color. Chronic and adverse outcomes. Systemic means the system works to produce those outcomes. It's not a one bad apple story where we just have one bad teacher who is, biased. It's not a story about one bad apple cop, but it's a set of institutional practices across various institutions that work in interlocking ways to confine, constrain, disadvantage, and discriminate and produce adverse chronic outcomes. Just want to say a word about chronic. Systemic racism requires and demonstrates that these are not easily resolved by simply fixing one area or fixing a few areas at once in a short-term period of time, because the accumulative effects of systemic racism across a very long period of time means that you're looking at a chronic condition. You can't literally solve educational inequality in one 5-year period, right? The chronic effects of educational inequality are substantial and require a thinking across areas. And you have to look at the relationships between education and housing segregation and wealth inequality and the criminalization of youth and the policing of schools, right? When you really put those pieces together, now you see the nature of the beast that we're up against, but it also helps explain what we're looking at in a much more effective way.
I wonder if we might just be able to go a little bit deeper on a couple of the particular sectors that you mentioned. So, if we're talking about structural racism in public schooling, for
Mhm.
example. What is that? What is that? How does that actually manifest itself?
Yeah. So there are a number of ways. The most important way that I think we should figure out how to honestly tackle is the fact that we primarily fund our public school budgets with home property taxes. That is to say, if you live in a town, your property taxes largely go, not exclusively, but they largely go to funding the public schools in your town. And this means that we are allowing those people with higher quality value homes, whatever the values are, that's a whole nother conversation about housing discrimination and the production of housing value based on race. But educational inequality means that people who don't have high levels of property value and pay high levels of property taxes don't have the same level of budget for their education and their schools. So that's one feature. And again, those property values are historically and contemporarily very much related to race, right? So we can talk about that separately if we have time, but I just want to stay on the ways in which educational inequality show up. So one is through property taxes. Two is that when teachers are divided among schools in a district where there are Black and brown and poor people schools, let's say Providence, you tend to find across the country that teachers with less experience and teachers with disciplinary problems are actually more likely to be located in schools with these poorer people of color constituencies. So they're not equipped, and they're often ill-equipped to be functioning as teachers. The second thing that we often see are the inability of the overcrowding of students in classrooms. There tend to be much larger classroom sizes in poorer schools and people of color. They are often handled with, because they don't have the fiscal resources, you see very little in the way of guidance counselors. You have high levels of police presence and literally a search and seizure process on your way into school. There's very little, the educational process itself is shaped by the climate and environment in the neighborhood. So I'm just naming a few things. I could be here a very long time, and I don't want to take our
It's a
whole show up
27-minute
on
show.
that. Yeah, I know. But basically, it's you see it in levels of teachers. You see it at the level of the physical infrastructure. You see it in the level of taxes, and you see it in the ways in which students are policed and criminalized.
There's one thing I want to just sort of explore just a little bit more, and I'm sorry, Wayne, but those decisions are, is there human agency in them? So the idea that teachers are who have disciplinary issue or less experience are more likely to teach in
Yeah.
poor schools with Black and brown populations. Is
Yeah.
that a conscious decision? Is there somebody in an HR office making those decisions? Or
Well,
is it the
yes,
structure that's
it's a structures require agency, and they require people to make decisions. Whether or not they're thinking consciously like you would in an apartheid like system, oh, blacks here, whites there, right? That's not quite how it's happening. It's a combination of factors. First of all, municipalities and governments and city hall respond very aggressively to white middle class constituencies. So they've got to make them happy. They are very concerned about white people leaving public schools, leaving their towns with their tax bases, and taking it somewhere else. So they listen very carefully. That means if I'm a white parent in a predominantly white town, if I complain, I will be listened to, and whatever my cohort of mothers and fathers complain about will usually result in some kind of action. On the same token, if Black and poor parents make the same complaints, they don't have the same political leverage, right? And that political leverage is raced and it's classed. So that's one factor. And then there's the other factor, which is that people literally do feel that poor and people of color can be a dumping ground for problems, and that problems that the teachers have can be actually offloaded onto the students, and they can be accused, and we'll believe them. So if someone says, oh no, teacher X is not a problem, they're perfectly fine teacher, we've just got students with problems and troubles and they're finding it difficult to adjust, we'll be like, yeah, I guess so, that's probably true. So there's also the disbelief factor that plays a role here.
So let's get into one more area, one of many that you have already enumerated, and that is health inequities and disparities. It's something we and I at the Providence Journal have written a lot about. It's
Yeah.
something that you've looked at extensively. Break that down for us. What are they? What are the outcomes, and what are the causes, and
Mhm.
what are the remedies? And again, there's a whole show right in that one
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to
question.
think like, what are the three things I'm going to say? And the project I'm working on, I don't actually focus in on health, but I did do a special kind of COVID edition
Okay.
talk on this because it was just a staggering. The disparities were so overwhelming that I was really wanted to look into it. So there are a few factors that come into being. One is that people who are that racism is a physically stressful experience, right? Racism and poverty together are especially extremely toxic to your health. Regardless, the low grade stress that people feel, the worry that Black people have about police is really extremely important to understand. I mean, I'm a very light-skinned, upper middle class Black woman at this point in my life. I started out extremely economically not wealthy. And but I literally see sirens behind me, and I start literally sweating, literally. And
So
you
it's
know,
it's a mental and a physical
it's an
reaction.
absolute the level.
Yeah.
There's a woman named Camera Jones who used to work at the CDC, and she did a study about resting heart rate, and showed that Black men have a sleep level resting heart rate of the same rate of activity during the day for whites. That means that when Black people are
Wow.
sleeping, they're actually awake and their heart is working in an awake state, that the
So they're
level of stress is consistent, and then it gets higher in obviously higher stress situations. So
they're
there's
hyper vigilant.
exactly. So you don't really get a kind of peaceful, restful interiority. So there's the physical dimensions, there's the health related dimensions, there's the food deserts in poor minority communities where healthy foods are too expensive and hard to get to. Um, Also related to transportation issues, right? Getting to healthy, affordable food. So there's a junk food phenomenon, right? Because it's what's available, and it's also what's cheaper. Bologna is cheaper than steak. Grass-fed steak, if you want to make sure your health is, if you're going to eat meat, I mean, who can afford it, right? And then what's the accessibility factor? And then, so there's the health related to those dimensions. There's the history of incredible racism by the medical profession. I mean, we all know about the Tuskegee experiments. For your listeners who don't, they should look it up. I won't take our time here. But the deliberate testing of Black people to see how diseases would progress on them without treating them, lying and claiming you were treating them, but not. There's the giving Black women hysterectomies so that they wouldn't have more Black children because slave owners didn't need any more, and Jim Crow doctors wanted to control post-enslavement populations. It was called the Mississippi appendectomy. It was so common, it had a name. And then there's the very common practice right now where Black patients are given a less pain relief than white patients because the belief that Black people can tolerate more pain. And, that's obviously some really sick, distorted logic that we make Black people suffer. They must be okay with it. So there, it somehow gets understood. So there's a consistent pattern of reduced levels of giving Black people medicine they should be getting to offset pain, and then there's just the non-believing of their symptoms. So Black people don't go to the doctor as regularly as they should. They're much more suspicious, rightfully so, about how they're going to be treated. Are they going to be over medicalized, under medicalized, done surgery when it isn't needed? And so that lack of trust means there's not good communication. Issues go on chronically unmet. So you have environmental conditions. I didn't even mention those. Toxic waste are highly, much more likely to be in poor people of color communities than anywhere else. So you have a toxic physical environment. You have the psychic stress of racism. You have the health elements related to food and access to healthy food, and then you have the medical profession itself. I mean, that's just off the top of my head. So, when you're thinking about this, you're not looking at just, when we talk about diabetes, right, is a Black health issue, people think, they should just eat better, watch their weight. I don't eat, whatever I don't eat, and they should do the same, right? It's an individual blame narrative, right? Instead of a systemic analysis of what are the factors and forces that are working together to produce the kind of outcomes that we see. That's why systemic analysis is so important.
So
Trisha,
the magnitude of the situation, and all of the other education, employment, housing, and so forth, the magnitude is enormous.
Yeah,
And history has shown we've made, if any progress, it's been in fits and starts, and
right.
such a ways to go. Do you see any progress or renewed progress or hope? I guess maybe that's the question I'm asking
Yeah, yeah.
in the
Well,
summer of 2020.
yeah, well, I mean, look, the biggest hope I have really experienced, there are two pieces. One is the level of outcry around the world around state-sponsored violence against poor people, people of color, Black people. There's been a global outcry, right? People are really trying to take a stand here. So this is very hopeful, because if enough people really say no, it has to change. And that, I want your listeners to know they really have a role to play. The second thing that makes me very hopeful is how much people want to learn about systemic racism now. And I've been called by lots of organizations, corporate organizations, educational organizations, student organizations, to help come explain what that means and why it's working the way it is. That's very encouraging, because a systemic analysis is the only way we're going to really tackle this. If we get rid of every bad cop and somehow reform or abolish or defund the police, that will not address a huge number of areas and issues that will remain. And that is both daunting, but also, I think, important for us to come to terms with, that this is not just a police issue.
Tricia, we are almost out of time, but we want to take a moment here and have you tell us a little bit about the Tightrope podcast that you're doing with Cornel West.
Yeah.
But we've literally got about 30 seconds to do
Okay,
that. So
great. I'll be quick about it. I'm really excited. I'm working with Dr. West, who's just a brilliant, amazing intellectual and everyday, freedom fighter. And we are doing this podcast called The Tightrope. It's available everywhere. If you just put in The Tightrope, you'll find it. It's on YouTube and all the various outlets on audio. And we're really trying to have an in-depth but accessible and fun but serious, meaningful conversation about justice, about art, about joy, about how to survive in this moment. And we're trying to reach people where they are and also bring them to where we hope we should all be, to a more just world.
Well, that's a great place for us to leave it. I listened to a few episodes getting ready for this, and I subscribed, and that's the biggest endorsement I can give it. So
that's fantastic. Thank you
should
both.
check it out. She's Tricia Rose. It's the Tightrope podcast. That's all the time we have this week for Story in the Public Square. But if you want to know more about the show, you can visit pellcenter.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us next time for more Story in the Public Square.